Taking me out to dinner with her German boss was my wife's idea. I sat there grinning like an idiot, acting as if I couldn't understand a single word of German. She gently rubbed her belly and reassured him, whispering, "Relax. The fool is overjoyed about the pregnancy. He'll raise your son believing it's his." Without losing my composure, I refilled my glass and replied in flawless German, "I'm happy you could join us. Stay with this story until the very end, and drop the name of the city you're watching from so I know how far it's traveled." Deep down, I should have sensed something was off the instant Cassidy proposed dinner with her boss. In 5 years of marriage, she had never shown the slightest interest in introducing me to Albert Richter. She always insisted their connection was purely business, that blending work with personal life crossed a line, and yet there I was, seated across from them in his home, watching her laugh at his jokes with a familiarity that twisted my gut. The restaurant couldn't have been more her style. Luxurious, private, the kind of place where one dinner cost more than most families' weekly groceries. Polished mahogany walls glowed beneath dim lighting, while the aroma of sauerbraten and warm bread drifted through the room. The white tablecloths were spotless, sharp as winter frost, and the crystal glasses shimmered under the lights. Every detail was immaculate, deliberately designed to impress. Naturally, Albert had selected the venue. He thrived on control, on flaunting his money and cultivated taste. At 48, he looked immaculate, dressed in a suit I immediately pegged at around $3,000. His silver hair was slicked back with deliberate precision, radiating that unmistakable European refinement. A faint but distinct accent colored his English, a subtle nod to his German roots that he seemed proud to carry. Meanwhile, I sat there in my off-the-rack blazer, painfully aware of how little I belonged. At 43, I'd built a solid career as an electrical engineer, earning $250,000 a year. Yet in that setting, I felt no more significant than the help. Cassidy had made a production out of dressing me for the evening, hovering for hours as she chose my outfit, treating me like a kid being prepped for school photos. Their conversation moved smoothly, far too smoothly. They talked about coworkers she had never once mentioned to me, laughing over private jokes that left me completely on the outside. I noticed the way Cassidy's face brightened whenever she looked at him, a spark I hadn't seen aimed at me in months, maybe even years. The way she leaned in when he spoke, the subtle motion of her fingers circling the rim of her wine glass, as she giggled at his stories. It all felt painfully intimate. I made an effort to join in, throwing out courteous questions about their projects, but every word from my mouth sounded stiff and rehearsed. They would briefly acknowledge me, just enough to maintain appearances, before slipping effortlessly back into their shared bubble. I wasn't a husband at that table. I was an extra, a silent spectator, watching a connection that was starting to look anything but professional. That evening, Cassidy looked stunning. She had devoted the entire afternoon to the salon, having her blonde hair styled into soft waves that framed her face flawlessly. Her makeup was immaculate, and the deep emerald dress she wore, one I had never seen before, likely cost more than my monthly car payment. She radiated that supposed pregnancy glow, her hand occasionally resting on the small curve of her belly that had only just begun to show. The pregnancy had caught us off guard. 3 months earlier, she had revealed it through happy tears and heartfelt promises about the beautiful family we were finally going to create. I still remembered the moment she held up the positive test, how my chest had swelled at the thought of becoming a father. At 43, I had already made peace with the idea that children might never happen for me. Then suddenly, there it was, a miracle, a second shot at the life I had always imagined. But as I studied her from across the table that night, a quiet unease settled in. The timeline had nagged at me from the start, though I'd chosen to ignore it. She announced the pregnancy right after returning from a business trip to Munich, the very trip where she had spent days working side by side with Albert on a high-stakes acquisition. When I carefully asked about the dates, she brushed me off, accusing me of overthinking trivial details. The waiter arrived with another bottle of wine, a German selection Albert presented as though unveiling a masterpiece. He filled each glass with deliberate flair. Cassidy only lifted hers to her lips without truly drinking, reminding us gently of her condition. I couldn't help but notice that Albert showed no disappointment when she declined the wine. If anything, his reaction was the opposite, almost satisfied, even protective, and the way his eyes lingered on her whenever the baby came up sent a chill straight through me. That was when they switched to German. It started harmlessly enough. Albert commented on the wine, mentioning the region it was from. Cassidy replied smoothly, confidently, her accent far more polished than I had ever heard before. I knew she had studied some German in college, but this was different. This wasn't textbook vocabulary. This was effortless, natural, comfortable. I stayed there with that same pleasant, clueless grin plastered on my face. The grin of a man they clearly underestimated. As their discussion flowed fully into German, they made no effort to bring me along, no polite translations, no brief summaries. I might as well have been part of the decor, another silent fixture at the table. What they didn't know was that my grandmother had been German. She immigrated to America when she was young, but she never abandoned her language or traditions. Every summer, she insisted I stay with her, drilling vocabulary and pronunciation into me until I became fluent. It had always been a quiet part of my life, a skill I never found reason to mention, not even to Cassidy. There had never been a moment where it seemed important, until now. So I listened. My expression never changed as Albert praised her performance. Not her performance at work, her performance with me. He told her how convincing she was, how flawlessly she played the part of the loving, devoted wife. My grip tightened around the stem of my wine glass while Cassidy laughed, the sound sharp and brittle, like glass cracking under pressure. She bragged about how effortless it was, how I accepted everything she told me without hesitation, how trusting I was, how naive. The word she chose was tolpelhaft, foolish, clumsy, stupid. Albert leaned in closer, lowering his voice to what he must have believed was a discreet whisper. He asked how I reacted to the pregnancy announcement, whether I had shown any suspicion. Cassidy shook her head, her hand drifting to her stomach. A gesture I once believed was pure maternal instinct, now felt calculated, deliberate. Keine Sorge, she said softly, amusement threading through her tone. Der Idiot ist so glücklich über die Schwangerschaft. Wird deinen Sohn großziehen und glauben, es sei sein eigener. Don't worry, the idiot is so thrilled about the pregnancy. He'll raise your son thinking it's his. In that instant, everything around me went still. The world didn't spin, it froze. In that instant, everything around me felt suspended in ice. The faint clatter of cutlery from nearby tables, the low hum of conversations, the golden flicker of candlelight, none of it seemed real anymore. Those sounds blurred into nothing as her words replayed in my head. Your son, not our son, yours. I remained seated there, that same foolish, trusting smile fixed on my face, while the foundation of my life caved in. 5 years of marriage exposed as nothing more than a staged act. 3 months of pure happiness about becoming a father twisted into the cruelest punchline imaginable. Every gentle touch, every shared plan, every whispered promise about forever, it had all been fiction. Carefully scripted lies delivered by a woman who saw me as nothing but a gullible prop. Albert reached across the table and clasped her hand, their fingers weaving together in a way so intimate it made my stomach churn. He told her he loved her, told her how thrilled he was about their baby, how flawlessly everything had unfolded. They had orchestrated it for months, he admitted. The pregnancy, the timing, even tonight's dinner was part of the design, a calculated performance. And I watched my wife, the woman carrying the child I had been ready to cherish with every part of my soul, smile proudly as her lover applauded her talent for deceiving me. He called her exceptional, said she had a gift for it, that she could make me believe absolutely anything. The waiter stepped up to the table, politely asking if we required anything further. I lifted my gaze toward him. My throat felt like sandpaper, yet when I spoke, my voice didn't tremble. Actually, yes, I said calmly, my words slicing through their German dialogue with quiet precision. I believe there's something important we should address. Both of them turned toward me, expressions still light, still careless, completely unaware the ground beneath them had already begun to crack. I reached for the wine bottle with steady hands and poured myself a full glass. The deep red liquid shimmered in the candlelight, dark and heavy like spilled blood. I placed the bottle back down with careful accuracy, centering it perfectly between us. Lifting my glass slightly, as though offering a toast, I locked eyes with Albert, Prost, I said clearly, letting the German words settle over the table like a storm cloud. To fresh starts, and the death of illusions. The color vanished from Cassidy's face so abruptly, I thought she might collapse. Albert's confident grin dissolved, replaced by a look that bordered on panic. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear nothing but the thunder of my own heartbeat. I could still make out the soft jazz drifting from concealed speakers. The low blend of saxophone and piano floated through the room, mingling with the quiet murmur of other diners enjoying what were probably ordinary, truthful evenings. Other couples sharing real conversations. Other husbands who weren't sitting there realizing their entire lives had been carefully engineered deceptions. Cassidy's wine glass quivered in her grip. A few drops of the dark red liquid slipped over the rim and stained the pristine white tablecloth, blooming outward like spilled blood. Her green eyes, the same ones I had fallen for 6 years earlier, flickered back and forth between Albert and me, wild and searching, like someone cornered with nowhere left to run. Albert managed to compose himself first, though only slightly. In a single breath, his polished confidence had cracked into visible alarm. He adjusted his tie, the small, anxious motion betraying the calm facade he was fighting to restore. "Neil," he began cautiously, his German accent suddenly heavier, more noticeable. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding." I placed my glass down with exact precision, the same deliberate care I used when handling complex circuitry at work. Controlled. Intentional. "I don't think there's any misunderstanding at all, Albert," I replied evenly in English, my tone light, almost pleasant. "I understood everything, every single word." Cassidy finally spoke, though her voice barely carried. "Neil, baby, you don't speak German. You're mistaken. Albert was only talking about his family, about his mother in Munich." The lie slid off her tongue effortlessly. Even now, even exposed, she still believed she could twist reality into something manageable. The woman who had slept beside me for 5 years, who had wept in my arms over childhood scars, who had sworn I was the love of her life, was staring straight at me and lying without the slightest flicker of guilt. "Your German is impressive, Cassidy," I said calmly, the steady tone clearly unsettling them more than anger would have. "Far better than you ever admitted. Especially the part where you described me as an idiot willing to raise another man's child. Your pronunciation of Topelhaft was especially sharp." The color drained from her face completely, not flushed, not pale, gone, as though someone had pulled life from her veins. The hand that had so tenderly rested on her stomach moments earlier, what I now recognized as pure theater, began to tremble uncontrollably. Albert leaned forward, urgency replacing every trace of charm. The casual dinner persona had vanished. "Neil, listen," he said quickly. "This is not what you think. Cassidy and I, yes, we work closely together, but tonight, this was simply business discussion." A sound almost escaped me. I nearly laughed. Almost. The sheer ridiculousness of it pressed against my ribs. This man had just listened to his lover outline their scheme to let me raise his child as my own, and he still had the audacity to label it business. "Business," I repeated slowly, rolling the word across my tongue as if testing its flavor. "Is that what you call praising the mother of your child for how convincingly she deceived her husband? Is that what you call talking about your son? Strategizing how to keep me in the dark?" My question settled over the table like a verdict. Around us, the restaurant carried on in graceful indifference. Servers floated between tables with polished smiles. Glasses chimed softly. Laughter rose and fell in warm waves. Life continued its elegant rhythm, as though mine hadn't just fractured beyond repair. I thought about the last 3 months, every second since Cassidy had shown me that positive test. The overwhelming happiness, the way I'd already begun mapping out nursery colors and college savings accounts, picturing early mornings teaching my son how to fish. I remembered calling my parents, my voice shaking with excitement as I told them they were finally going to be grandparents. I'd started reading parenting books, determined to become the kind of father I'd once wished for myself. Every hope, every plan, built on fiction. To them, it had been entertainment, a private joke exchanged between two people who saw me as nothing more than a useful, unsuspecting stand-in. Cassidy reached across the table, her hand stretching toward mine. I withdrew before her fingers could make contact, the movement sharp enough to make her recoil. "Neil, please," she whispered, her composure finally cracking. Tears gathered in those green eyes I once believed were the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. "You have to let me explain. You misunderstood. My German isn't that strong. I must have said something wrong." Even now she was trying to rewrite reality, something that only sounded worse than I intended. Even cornered by the most blatant lie imaginable, she was still attempting to twist reality, still trying to make me question what I had clearly heard, what I had understood without a single doubt. It was almost impressive. If I hadn't been fluent, if I hadn't caught every vicious syllable, I might have faltered. I might have convinced myself that I'd misinterpreted it. That suspicion had distorted harmless words into something ugly. Realizing how thoroughly I had been deceived cut nearly as deep as the betrayal itself. How many other times had she fabricated stories? How many private conversations had taken place in languages she assumed were safe from my understanding? How many colleagues, friends, how many people were aware that her devoted wife act was nothing more than theater? And for how long has this been my reality? "How long?" I asked quietly, my voice thin but steady. Albert and Cassidy shared a glance. Brief, loaded, unspoken. That look told me more than any explanation could. This wasn't a recent lapse in judgment. It wasn't some impulsive mistake. It was practiced, familiar, established. "How long?" I repeated, louder now. Cassidy parted her lips, no doubt preparing another carefully constructed excuse, but Albert rested a hand on her arm, stopping her. His expression shifted. Maybe it was surrender. Maybe relief that the charade had finally collapsed. Or maybe it was pure arrogance, the assumption that once the truth was out, I was powerless to respond. 2 years, he said flatly. 2 years. The number echoed in my mind as I did the calculation. 2 years ago was when Cassidy had started collaborating closely with Albert's firm, when the business trips multiplied, when Munich became a regular destination, when late nights at the office became routine and unexplained absences blended seamlessly into her career ambitions. That was when she started coming home later than usual, when designer dresses and new jewelry began appearing, supposedly little rewards she'd bought herself for working so hard. 2 full years of carefully constructed lies. 2 years of leaving his bed and returning to mine. 2 years of shared meals, shared conversations, shared intimacy, while living an entirely separate life behind my back. 2 years of convincing me I was loved, all while orchestrating the most humiliating betrayal imaginable. Suddenly, the pregnancy timeline clicked into place with brutal clarity. She hadn't conceived during our romantic weekend by the coast 3 months ago. The trip I believed had reignited something between us. She was already pregnant when we went. Already carrying Albert's child while I naively thought I was reconnecting with my wife instead of sleeping beside someone who had been deceiving me for years. "The baby," I said quietly. My voice sounded distant, stripped of everything. "When is the due date? The real one?" Tears streamed down Cassidy's face now, mascara streaking over her flawless makeup. "Neil, please," she sobbed. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through it." "When?" I pressed. "December," Albert replied when she couldn't force the words out. "December 15th. I calculated automatically. December meant conception in March. But she hadn't told me until June, claiming she was barely 6 weeks along. Another fabrication. Another deliberate adjustment of dates, so I would never question paternity. The waiter approached again, his professional composure slipping as he absorbed the scene before him. Cassidy in tears, Albert tense and defensive, and me sitting unnaturally still, like a man whose world had just detonated in silence. "Is everything all right here?" he asked cautiously. "Actually," I said, rising slowly from my chair, surprised at how steady my legs felt considering the wreckage inside me. "I think I need some air. And Albert, you can handle the check tonight. That feels appropriate." I reached for my wallet out of habit, but he lifted a hand quickly. "Neil, wait. We need to discuss this. We need to figure out how to handle the situation." Handle the situation. As if my shattered marriage were a scheduling conflict, a logistical inconvenience in their romance, something to be managed between meetings. There's nothing to handle, I replied evenly, my calmness more unsettling than anger ever could be. You already have each other. You've had each other for 2 years. You're expecting a child together. It seems everything unfolded exactly the way you intended. I turned to leave, but Cassidy's voice rang out behind me, loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables. Where are you going? She demanded. Neil, you can't just walk away. We live together. We're married. We have to fix this. I faced her again. This woman who had shared my bed, my plans, my quiet hopes for the future, while methodically dismantling them behind my back. Now she looked terrified, not heartbroken, terrified, as if she was finally realizing that the carefully balanced double life she'd maintained was tipping beyond her control. No, Cassidy, I said softly. There's nothing left to fix. You made your decision 2 years ago. You made it again 3 months ago, when you chose to let me believe that child was mine, and you made it tonight, when you laughed about how easy it was to deceive me. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Conversations had thinned into awkward murmurs. People were pretending not to stare. I didn't care. Let them witness it. Let them see how neatly a life could unravel over imported wine and sauerbraten. You know what's almost funny? I added, glancing between them. I loved you. Both of you in different ways. Cassidy, I gave you everything. And Albert, I respected you. I believed you were a man of integrity. I genuinely thought you were better than this. I pulled my phone from my pocket and placed it carefully in the center of the table. I've been recording since you switched to German, I said smoothly, watching the blood drain from their faces all over again. Technology is incredible these days. Translation software, voice recognition. A man doesn't even need to understand the language to know when he's being betrayed. I hadn't recorded a single second, but they didn't know that, and the panic flickering across their expressions told me exactly how much damage the truth could cause if it reached the wrong ears. I won't be there when you get home, I told Cassidy, picking up my phone. Don't call, don't text, don't try to explain, don't try to fix it, I added quietly. Some damage doesn't come with a repair option. Then I walked away, away from my wife, away from her lover, away from the child they had planned to place in my arms like a beautifully wrapped lie. With every step toward the exit, I felt oddly lighter, as if the weight of ignorance had been heavier than the truth itself. Behind me, Cassidy's voice chased after me, sharp, frantic, cracking with desperation. She called my name more than once. I never turned around. I drove aimlessly for 2 hours after leaving the restaurant. My hands clamped around the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned bone white. I couldn't go home. Not yet. I wasn't prepared to walk into a house that suddenly felt like a stage set. The home we had chosen together. The framed photographs lining the mantel. The spare bedroom we'd started discussing as a nursery. Every corner of it now tainted by what I knew. Eventually, I found myself parked outside a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. I sat inside with a mug of coffee that tasted like burnt oil, staring at nothing while trying to process everything. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, washing the room in a harsh, unforgiving glare. It felt fitting. This kind of truth didn't belong under candlelight. It didn't deserve elegance or soft shadows. It demanded exposure. Bright, clinical, impossible to ignore. My phone had been vibrating non-stop since I left. 17 missed calls from Cassidy. 11 messages I couldn't bring myself to open. 3 calls from Albert, which almost made me laugh. What explanation could he possibly offer? What justification existed for betraying a man and plotting to hand him another man's child as his own? I powered the phone down completely and let the silence settle around me. Sitting there in that sterile light, I found myself thinking back to when my grandmother first began teaching me German. Long afternoons at her kitchen table, repeating words until they felt natural on my tongue. I had never imagined that quiet childhood lessons would one day be the reason I saw my life clearly, instead of living it as a lie. My grandmother, Oma Greta, was not a woman you argued with. She believed fiercely that knowledge was the one possession no one could ever strip away. She had endured the war, arrived in America with nothing but a small suitcase and stubborn determination, and built a life from pure willpower. From the time I was 8 until I turned 16, she claimed 2 months of every summer. During those weeks, English simply didn't exist. If I wanted breakfast, I asked for it in German. If I wanted to go outside, I requested it in German. At first, I resented every second. I was an American kid who wanted baseball games and scraped knees, not grammar drills and vocabulary lists. But Greta never wavered. She would confiscate my comic books until I recited verb conjugations flawlessly. She made me translate American movies scene by scene while we watched them together. She refused to answer me unless I spoke her language correctly. If I stumbled, she waited in silence until I tried again. By high school, I wasn't just conversational, I was fluent. More than that, I could think in German, dream in it. I understood the rhythm, the cultural weight behind certain phrases, the subtle shifts in tone that changed everything. It became second nature. I was proud of it, quietly. But it never seemed particularly useful. None of my friends spoke German. My career as an electrical engineer didn't require it. I never listed it on applications because it felt irrelevant to circuit boards and domestic contracts. And I never told Cassidy. Early in our relationship, she had mentioned taking German in college. I'd smiled, made a neutral comment, and moved the conversation elsewhere. There hadn't been a reason to reveal anything. It felt like one of those trivial personal facts, like knowing how to juggle or memorizing every lyric to a Beatles song. Interesting, maybe, meaningless, ultimately, until it wasn't. That overlooked, almost forgotten skill had exposed the single most devastating truth of my life. When I finally pulled into the driveway, it was just before midnight. The house stood in darkness. Except for the porch light, Cassidy always left on when I worked late. A warm, familiar glow that once meant home. Once, that porch light had felt warm, thoughtful. The quiet signal of a normal wife waiting for her husband in what I believed was a normal marriage. Now even that simple gesture felt rehearsed. Another detail in a 2-year performance designed to keep me comfortable, unquestioning. Her car sat in the garage. She was home, awake. Light spilled from beneath the bedroom door upstairs, and I could hear her footsteps moving back and forth, pacing, rehearsing, no doubt constructing the next version of reality she would try to sell me. I didn't go up. Instead, I turned toward my study, the only room in the house that had ever been entirely mine. Dark leather chairs I had chosen myself, shelves lined with technical manuals and worn classics, a heavy wooden desk where I handled freelance contracts or simply sat in silence when I needed space. The air carried a faint trace of leather polish and the scotch I kept tucked in the bottom drawer. It was the closest thing I had to a sanctuary. I poured 3 fingers of Macallan 18-year-old, a bottle I had been saving for something meaningful. This qualified, just not in any way I had once imagined. That was when I began to dissect the timeline, not emotionally, analytically, the same cold precision I used to troubleshoot complex electrical systems. If the affair had lasted 2 years, there would be data, patterns, small irregularities I had overlooked because trust had blinded me. I opened my laptop and logged into our financial accounts, something I rarely bothered with. Cassidy managed the household expenses. With her business degree, it had always seemed logical. I focused on earning. She handled the logistics. I had given her full access to everything without hesitation. Scrolling through 2 years of statements, my stomach tightened. There were charges I didn't recognize. High-end restaurants I had never visited. Boutique hotels in cities where she'd supposedly been traveling solo for conferences. Purchases from specialty lingerie stores. Brands I had never seen in our bedroom. Individually, the transactions were subtle, easy to overlook, but together, they formed a pattern. And patterns don't lie. Nearly $20,000 in unexplained spending. It had been buried carefully, tucked between mortgage payments, utility bills, grocery runs. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms. But when I looked at the data the way I would examine a circuit diagram, the pattern was unmistakable. Every month, like precision engineering, charges appeared at the same luxury hotel downtown, the Meridian, where rooms started at $400 a night, always Thursday afternoons, always followed by reservations at upscale restaurants within walking distance. Occasionally there were transactions from jewelry stores, high-end boutiques and spas known for couples packages. I cross-checked the dates against Cassidy's meticulously maintained work calendar on our shared desktop. Every single Thursday entry aligned perfectly. Client meeting, AR, Albert Richter. She hadn't even bothered to disguise it. She had logged the affair into our shared calendar, as if I would never think to look. The jewelry receipts were worse. 3 weeks after our 5th wedding anniversary, there was an $8,000 diamond tennis bracelet. She'd told me she bought it for herself to celebrate closing a major account. I remembered how proud I'd felt. Proud of her ambition. Proud that my wife was successful enough to reward herself. Now I saw it clearly. It had likely been Albert's gift, paid for through our joint account. My income is funding her lover's gesture. She had used my money to purchase proof of her betrayal and then thanked me for supporting her career. The audacity was staggering. Then I found the pregnancy test receipt. Not one test, 3 different brands. Purchased 2 weeks before she told me the news. March 23rd. If she was testing in late March, conception would have happened in early March. During the first half of March, I was in Seattle attending a professional conference. The receipts were right there. Airfare, hotel invoices, restaurant bills, 3,000 miles away. I had come home from that trip to a wife who seemed unusually affectionate, eager, almost relieved. I'd thought the distance had made her miss me. I'd believed the renewed intimacy meant we were reconnecting. In reality, she hadn't been alone while I was gone. And when I returned, she had wrapped herself around me, not out of love, but to reinforce the lie. She had been erasing her footprints, making sure that when she finally shared the good news, the timeline would appear flawless. I grabbed a calculator and ran the numbers properly. If the due date was December 15th, and a full-term pregnancy runs roughly 40 weeks from the last menstrual cycle, conception would have occurred around March 20th, right in the middle of my trip to Seattle. Right when I physically couldn't have been the father. The conclusion wasn't emotional. It was mathematical, precise. For 2 years she had been unfaithful. Now she was carrying another man's child. And the deception hadn't been impulsive. It had been engineered. Dates calculated. Announcements timed. Intimacy strategically deployed. A carefully constructed narrative designed to convince me I was about to become a father. Soft footsteps echoed on the staircase. Slow, hesitant. Cassidy. I closed the laptop before she reached the door and took another measured sip of scotch, steadying myself for whatever version of her I was about to meet. She appeared in the doorway, wearing one of my old college t-shirts and loose pajama pants. Her makeup was gone. Her hair pulled back into a careless ponytail. She looked fragile, younger, afraid, almost identical to the girl I had woken up beside 6 years ago on our first morning together. It was an excellent performance. If I hadn't heard her laughing about my stupidity just hours earlier, I might have believed it. I might have felt compassion. "Neil," she said softly, her voice small and uncertain. "Can we talk?" I motioned to the chair across from my desk, the same place where we used to sit side by side reviewing budgets and mapping out our future. Tonight it felt different, less like a planning seat, more like a place where confessions were extracted. She lowered herself into it carefully, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Real tears, or just another layer of the act? At this point, I wasn't sure I could tell the difference. "I know you're angry," she began, barely audible. "I know it sounded awful," she said softly, forcing the tremble in her voice. "But Neil, you have to trust me. You misheard. My German isn't strong enough to say what you think I said. Even now, even after everything had been exposed." She wasn't retreating from the lie. She was reinforcing it, trying to convince me that my own comprehension was flawed, that 3 decades of fluency had somehow failed me in the one moment it mattered most. "Tell me about the meridian," I said evenly. The blood drained from her face so quickly it was almost visible. Her lips parted, then pressed together again. No explanation was formed. "Tell me about the $8,000 bracelet you bought yourself 3 weeks after our anniversary," I continued, my tone measured and precise. "Tell me about the pregnancy tests you purchased on March 23rd, 2 weeks before you told me you were expecting." I leaned back slightly, watching her unravel. "Tell me why you've been meeting Albert Richter at luxury hotels every Thursday for the past 18 months. Her hands were shaking openly now, not the subtle tremor of nerves, the violent trembling of someone who realizes the facade has collapsed completely. This wasn't being caught in a single mistake. This was an exposure of a long, deliberate strategy. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "I found out about tonight." "Tonight," I answered honestly. "The rest? I've been uncovering it for the past 3 hours. It's remarkable what financial statements reveal when someone finally decides to read them." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving as sobs broke through her composure. They sounded real, painful, raw, but so had everything else. At this point, I couldn't separate authenticity from performance. With Cassidy, every emotion now felt suspect. "Neil, please," she choked out between tears. "Just let me explain." "It's not what you think," she insisted through tears. "It's complicated." "No," I said quietly, draining the last of my scotch and placing the glass down with deliberate finality. "It's actually very simple. You've been involved with him for 2 years. You're carrying his child, and you intended to let me believe it was mine. There's nothing complicated about that." I rose to my feet, the exhaustion finally settling into my bones. Holding on to calm had taken more energy than anger ever would have. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight," I continued. "Tomorrow, I'll be contacting an attorney. You should consider doing the same." As I reached the door, her voice followed me one last time, fragile, desperate. "What about us? What about our marriage? What about the baby?" I turned and looked at her. This woman who had shared my bed, my plans, my quiet hopes, while dismantling them piece by piece behind my back. "There is no us," I said evenly. "There never really was, and it's not my child." Then I walked out of the study, out of the house, out of the life I had believed belonged to me. A life that I now understood had been carefully staged from the start. The hotel rooms smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and the lingering presence of countless traveling salesmen before me. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress at 2 in the morning, phone in hand, waiting for daylight so I could begin the methodical process of undoing everything. Sleep wasn't an option. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her at the restaurant, glowing, amused, leaning toward him as she described how easy I was to manipulate. I heard the word again: idiot, fool, a man happily preparing to raise another man's son. And each time, I relived that moment, the instant the illusion shattered, that sickening drop in my stomach, that cold, irreversible understanding, as the world I thought I knew turned to dust. The financial statements were scattered across the hotel desk like exhibits in a criminal investigation, which in a way they were. Before leaving the house, I had printed every transaction, wanting something tangible, something I could hold in my hands that proved the betrayal wasn't imagined. $20,000 over 2 years might not sound catastrophic, but it was never about the total. It was about precision, the intention, the effortless cruelty of using my own income to bankroll her affair. And yet the bank records were nothing compared to what I uncovered in Cassidy's email. She had never been cautious with passwords. For years we'd shared login information for convenience, an unspoken symbol of trust between spouses. At the time, it had felt intimate, transparent. Now it granted me access to a digital archive of her second life. The correspondence with Albert stretched back 26 months. At first, the messages were professional: project updates, scheduling details, corporate jargon. But as I scrolled forward, the tone shifted, subtle at first, a compliment here, a private joke there. Then the language warmed, intensified, lines blurred. Within weeks, business had transformed into flirtation, flirtation into seduction, seduction into a meticulously organized affair, complete with hotel reservations and coded references to their Thursday rituals. That was when I learned something else. Albert was married. Not just married, married to Helena Richter. And Helena wasn't simply wealthy. Her family owned a portfolio of luxury hotels across Europe, generational wealth, the kind tied to reputation, legacy, public image. A divorce would have been expensive, public, potentially catastrophic for him. So instead of leaving his wife, he had installed mine as a hidden investment. The emails revealed allowances, carefully structured payments disguised as consulting bonuses, jewelry selected in advance, spa weekends arranged under the guise of corporate travel. He had funded her lifestyle while preserving his polished facade at home. And the pregnancy? It wasn't accidental. It had been discussed, planned, strategically aligned with what Albert referred to in one message as the Seattle opportunity. They hadn't just planned logistics, they had profiled me. One email thread was devoted almost entirely to analyzing my personality, my routines, my habits, my emotional blind spots. Albert had written it like a strategy memo. Bullet points, observations, risk assessments. Neil avoids conflict. Neil believes in loyalty. Neil wants children badly enough to ignore inconsistencies. Neil trusts financial systems and won't monitor small discrepancies. Cassidy had responded with refinements. She described how I processed information slowly when it involved people I loved, how I defaulted to giving the benefit of the doubt, how my pride would keep me from demanding a paternity test, because he won't want to look paranoid. Reading it felt like dissecting my own autopsy report. They hadn't seen me as a husband, or even as an obstacle. I had been an asset, a revenue stream, a stable emotional anchor for a child they intended to weaponize, a legal shield that would absorb liability until it was convenient to discard me. One line from Albert lodged itself in my mind with surgical precision. He's predictable, the kind of man who will do the honorable thing even when it destroys him. Cassidy's reply had been worse. That's why I married him. I stared at that sentence for a long time, not because it surprised me, but because it reframed 6 years of memories in a single brutal instant. Our first apartment, the late-night conversations about future kids, the way she used to squeeze my hand during ultrasounds of friends' babies and whisper, "Someday." All of it leveraged, even their long-term divorce strategy had legal foresight baked into it. Albert had outlined jurisdictional advantages, timelines for establishing presumed paternity, and projections for asset division. He referenced precedents, custody optics, public perception management. It wasn't romance, it was infrastructure. A decade-long extraction plan built on the assumption that I would remain exactly who I had always been. Decent, trusting, slow to suspect betrayal. The most suffocating realization wasn't that they thought I was foolish. It was that, until tonight, they had been right. I sat back in the hotel chair, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. For 2 years, they had choreographed my future, decided which holidays I would spend believing a lie, which birthday parties I would attend, which school pickups I would make. They had plotted out my emotional attachments with the same detachment someone uses to plan an investment portfolio. 10 years. 10 years of loving a child who would carry another man's DNA while I signed tuition checks and bedtime stories. And they laughed about it. Not in anger, not in desperation, in amusement. The cruelty wasn't explosive. It was clinical. That was the part that hollowed me out. Passion fades. Mistakes happen. Weakness can be forgiven. But this was the design. Albert had written about me the way a scientist writes about a lab rat. My pathological need to be needed. My hunger for family. My dependence on female approval. He dissected me in paragraphs, identifying weaknesses, mapping pressure points, explaining to Cassidy exactly which emotional levers to pull and when. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I had always defined myself by usefulness, by being the steady one, the provider, the man who fixed things and absorbed stress and held everyone together. When my parents divorced, I was 12 and convinced that if I were just better, quieter, kinder, less demanding, I could somehow repair what was breaking around me. I became a good son, the accommodating friend, the reliable boyfriend. It hadn't saved my family, but the habit calcified into identity. I gravitated toward women who needed something, stability, reassurance, rescue. In giving, I felt anchored, valuable, chosen. Cassidy had understood that from the beginning. One of her emails described our early relationship with surgical clarity. She explained to Albert how she had framed herself as overwhelmed, fragile, just a little lost, how she had allowed me to believe I was lifting her out of chaos, how she had cried at the right moments, withheld at the right moments, rewarded my protectiveness with gratitude and admiration. She loves feeling saved, Albert had written. No, Cassidy replied. He loves saving. Every memory shifted under that light. The nights she trembled in my arms, recounting her difficult childhood. The insecurities she confessed about not feeling good enough. The way she'd look at me like I was the only solid thing in her world. A performance. Not spontaneous vulnerability. Strategy. I hadn't just fallen in love with fiction. I had fallen in love with a character crafted specifically to interface with my emotional architecture. The hotel room felt airless as I absorbed it all. The carpet cleaner stung my nose. The hum of the HVAC filled the silence where my marriage used to be. Humiliation burned hot at first. Then something else began to take shape. Colder. Sharper. Rage. Yes, but refined. Directed. They had studied me, but they had also made an assumption that I would remain the man they had profiled. Predictable. Passive. Honor-bound to my own detriment. That assumption was their flaw. Albert's emails were a trove of more than infidelity. He wasn't merely cheating, he was systematizing it. At least 2 other women over 5 years, each receiving allowances structured as consulting retainers. Gifts routed through shell accounts. Travel disguised as site inspections. He ran his personal life the way he ran his businesses. Compartmentalized, optimized, insulated. But insulation isn't immunity. The correspondence included more than romantic logistics. There were details about import operations that shaved duties through manipulated invoices. Tax structures that leaned hard against legality. Partnerships with entities that appeared to exist only on paper. Revenue transfers timed to exploit reporting gaps. He spoke about these matters casually, assuming privacy he no longer had. I realized something as I sifted through it all. Albert believed himself untouchable because the people in his orbit were dependent on him. Employees, mistresses, even Cassidy. He thought money ensured silence. He thought leverage only flowed one direction. By dawn, the hotel desk was covered in organized stacks. Affairs timeline, financial cross-references, business irregularities, direct quotes, screenshots cataloged, backup copies made. I wasn't acting on impulse. I wasn't smashing anything. I wasn't drunk dialing threats. I was documenting. If they had treated my life like a long-term investment strategy, then I would respond in kind, carefully, methodically. They had spent 2 years constructing a deception designed to hollow me out slowly. They had assumed that once exposed, I would collapse. Instead, as the first light crept through the curtains, I felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Clarity. They had studied my needs. They had never studied what happens when that need is severed. Not just proof of the affair, proof of everything. Financial discrepancies threaded through multiple accounts. Tax positioning that leaned too far into gray. Travel records that didn't align cleanly with declared purposes. Cross-border movements that raised uncomfortable immigration questions if examined closely. By sunrise, the scattered fragments had become structured. A dossier. Indexed. Time-stamped. Backed up twice. It would not destroy Albert if released publicly. It would destabilize him. But the public scandal was chaotic. Uncontrolled. Collateral damage everywhere. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted precision. At 7:02 a.m., 2 a.m., I called my lawyer. At 7:41, my accountant. At 8:15, my bank. By 10, our joint accounts were frozen pending review. My individual assets were insulated, credit lines monitored, automatic transfers halted, documentation requests initiated for every shared expense over the last 2 years. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, paperwork, systems, process. If my marriage had been a long-running con, then I would unwind it like a forensic audit. The divorce would not be emotional. It would be efficient. Cassidy would receive exactly what the law required, and not a cent cushioned by guilt or nostalgia. Her financial deception would be documented line by line. Every consulting bonus, every luxury charge, every Thursday at the hotel. She had mistaken kindness for incompetence. That miscalculation would cost her, but Albert required a different approach. Albert believed himself insulated by complexity. Wealth layered over influence, layered over discretion. Complex systems, however, have seams. There was a private investigator I had once retained during a patent dispute. Discreet, meticulous, comfortable in corporate shadows. A man who understood that leverage is rarely about noise, it's about timing. When he answered, I didn't embellish. I need a thorough review, I said. Corporate structures, offshore relationships, travel patterns, quietly. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. By noon, the wheels were turning. Not vengeance in the cinematic sense. Consequences. Measured. Legal. Patient. I wasn't interested in screaming matches or shattered glass. I was interested in pressure applied at structural points. In audits triggered. Inquiries initiated. In conversations Albert would have with attorneys that would cost him sleep. He had built a life on the assumption that everyone around him was dependent. He had never factored in the possibility that one of them might disengage. I checked out of the hotel just after 11 and drove back to the house. The driveway was empty. Inside, the air felt still, neutral, as if the walls were waiting to see who would claim them. Cassidy was at work, most likely, performing normalcy, answering emails, smiling at colleagues, carrying a child conceived in calculation while the scaffolding of her arrangement began to loosen. I packed deliberately, clothes first, important documents, a few personal items that held meaning independent of her, old photographs from before we met, my father's watch, the drafting notebook I'd kept since college. I paused in the doorway of the spare bedroom. The nursery plans were still sketched faintly on the wall in pencil. Measurements, furniture placements, notes about paint colors. I erased them with the side of my hand until the lines blurred into nothing, not out of anger, out of clarity. They had mapped 10 years of my life without consent. They had assumed my trajectory was fixed. But standing there in the quiet house, suitcase half-zipped at my feet, I understood something they hadn't anticipated. I was no longer the man they had profiled, and the most dangerous variable in any plan is the one that changes. But there was a note waiting on my desk, written in Cassidy's careful, elegant handwriting on thick cream stationery I had probably paid for without noticing. She claimed she loved me, that she never meant for things to go so far, that we could fix everything if I would just let her explain. She insisted the baby could still be mine, that the timing wasn't as certain as I believed, that I was about to throw away our marriage over a misunderstanding. I read the note twice, not because it moved me, but because I was struck by her persistence. Even now, even after I had heard her refer to the child as Albert's son in perfect German, she was still trying to plant doubt, still reaching for the one weakness she believed would work hope. I folded the note and slipped it into my jacket pocket, not out of sentiment, but because it documented her continued attempt to manipulate me after being caught. Then I walked slowly through the house one last time, taking in the kitchen where we had cooked together, the living room where we had planned our future, the bedroom where we had whispered about baby names in the dark. Everything looked unchanged, which somehow made it worse. Betrayal doesn't alter walls or furniture. It seeps backward into memory and contaminates it. Yet I wasn't sad anymore, and I wasn't raging. Anger is loud and reckless. What I felt was quieter, more deliberate. I was motivated. 3 weeks passed after that dinner at Doe's house. 3 weeks of careful preparation. I had always believed in patience. My grandmother used to say, revenge served cold was twice as satisfying as revenge served hot, and the principle applied perfectly now. The private investigator I hired, Marcus Chen, proved worth every dollar of the $15,000 I paid him. A former federal agent specializing in corporate investigations, he assembled a report that was devastating precisely because it was factual. Albert's business empire, polished on the surface, was riddled with aggressive accounting tactics, questionable tax shelters, fragile partnerships, and financial structures that would not survive sustained scrutiny. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together enough to create serious problems. More importantly, Albert's wife Helena was not only wealthy but influential and deeply protective of her family's reputation. She had handled his previous infidelities quietly but decisively, ensuring consequences without public spectacle. A planned child, documented payments, and a clear paper trail would not fit neatly into that pattern. By the end of the 3rd week, I had organized everything into structured files, one for my attorney, already active, one held in reserve, and one prepared for Helena, factual and chronological, free of emotion. I wasn't interested in chaos or public scandal. I wanted inquiry, pressure, leverage applied at exactly the right points. Cassidy believed I would react emotionally. Albert believed I would collapse. Neither understood that once hope is removed, clarity takes its place, and clarity is far more dangerous than anger. According to Marcus's research, Helena had discovered Albert's previous affairs and had handled each one quietly and efficiently. The women involved hadn't faced public humiliation. They had simply found doors closing, contracts withdrawn, invitations rescinded, funding evaporated. Helena didn't need confrontation. She applied pressure through banks, social circles, and influence that stretched into places most people never saw. It was the kind of old European wealth that operated through networks rather than noise. Albert knew exactly what she was capable of, which was why he had kept Cassidy hidden so carefully. But secrecy depends on control, and control shifts when someone decides to shine a light in the right direction. I was sitting in my new apartment, a sleek downtown loft that cost $3,000 more per month than the suburban house, but felt cleaner, more honest when my phone rang. Cassidy's name lit up the screen. It was the first time she had tried to contact me in over a week. Technically, we were deep into divorce proceedings, and my lawyer had advised that all communication go through him. I almost let it ring out. Curiosity stopped me. I wanted to hear the angle. "Neil?" Her voice was smaller than I remembered, threaded with something that sounded like fear. "Please don't hang up. I need to talk to you." "About what?" I asked, my tone even, detached. I had learned to speak to her the way one speaks to a stranger, polite, distant, unaffected. About Albert, about what's happening. "I think I made a terrible mistake." That caught my attention. I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of mistake?" There was a pause, filled with uneven breathing. "He's not who I thought he was. The things he's been asking me to do, the way he's been treating me since that dinner. Neil, I think he might be dangerous." Dangerous was an interesting choice of word. From what Marcus had uncovered, Albert was ruthless and ethically flexible, but not reckless in a physical sense. If there was danger, it was reputational, financial, structural. "What has he been asking you to do?" I kept my voice neutral. "He wants me to lie in the divorce. He wants me to claim the baby is yours, to push for child support, to take half of everything. He says if I don't, he'll cut me off completely. He'll ruin my career, make sure I never work in this industry again." So he was tightening the leash, exactly as predicted. Albert had too much invested to let the narrative collapse now. Pressure was inevitable. "And you're calling me because," I prompted. "Because I can't keep doing this," she said, her composure cracking. "I'm scared of what happens if I keep lying, and I'm scared of what happens if I stop. I know you hate me, but you're the only one who might be able to help." The irony settled heavily between us. 3 weeks ago, I had been the predictable husband, the emotional asset. The man is easy to manage. Now I was her contingency plan. The woman who spent 2 years lying to me is suddenly afraid of being lied to. I asked quietly, "Why would Albert care what you do in our divorce? If he loves you, why not leave his wife and build a life with you?" Silence answered first, then breathing. "He's not going to leave Helena, is he?" I continued. "He never was. You were convenient, and now you're inconvenient." "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's complicated. His wife isn't just rich, she's connected. If she finds out about me, about the baby, she could destroy both of us. Albert says we have to wait. We have to be careful." "How long?" I asked. 5 years? 10? Until the child's grown? Until Helena dies?" She began crying then. Soft, uneven sobs that once would have split me open. Now they sounded different. Not like heartbreak, like fear of fallout. "I know I don't deserve your help," she said. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I'm pregnant and alone and scared, and I don't know what else to do." Pregnant, alone, scared. A year ago that combination would have overridden everything. I would have stepped in automatically, reflexively, needing to fix it. But I could hear the construction of it now. The narrative shaped to trigger exactly what Albert had once itemized in bullet points. "You're not alone," I said evenly. "You have Albert, the father of your child, the man you chose. Ask him, because he doesn't care about me." The words broke out of her before she could soften them. The mask slipped. "He never cared. I was useful. That's it. And now that things are complicated, he just wants to manage it, manage me. There it was. She had discovered what it feels like to be a variable in someone else's strategy. What do you want from me? I asked. I want to tell the truth in the divorce, she said quickly, as if afraid she'd lose the nerve. I want to admit the baby isn't yours. I want to stop asking for money, stop pretending. But Albert says if I do that, he'll ruin me. He'll make sure I never work again. He'll tell people I'm unstable. He has connections. He can destroy my reputation. So she wanted to confess, not because remorse had awakened, but because the cost-benefit analysis had shifted. Continuing the deception had become riskier than abandoning it. You're afraid he'll ruin you, I said. Yes, and you think I can protect you. Another silence, smaller this time. Yes. I leaned back in my chair and stared out at the skyline through the tall glass windows. 3 weeks ago, she had laughed about how easy I was to fool, how predictable, how honorable to a fault. Now she was calling that same predictability her only hope. Cassidy, I said slowly, you didn't call because you suddenly respect the truth. You called because you're losing control. That's not fair. No, I replied. Fair would have been telling me before you got pregnant. Fair would have been not planning a 10-year extraction strategy. She inhaled sharply, but didn't argue. You're right, she whispered. I was wrong. About everything. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. It almost didn't matter. The real question wasn't whether she felt guilt. It was whether helping her served me. She didn't want to do the right thing. She wanted a new shield. Albert had stopped protecting her, so she was reaching for the next available structure. And you think I should protect you from the consequences of your own choices? I asked. I think you should want the truth to come out, she said, her voice strengthening as she found an angle that sounded principled. I think you should want everyone to know you're not the father, that you're not responsible. I think you should want your freedom. She wasn't wrong about that part. I did want the truth. I did want legal and financial separation from a child who wasn't mine. But not because she was suddenly offering honesty like a peace offering. The truth was already in motion. It simply wasn't hers to control anymore. I'll think about it, I said smoothly. Then I let a beat of silence stretch between us. But understand something, Cassidy. Whatever protection you imagine I might offer, you forfeited that 2 years ago when you chose to lie, and you buried it 3 weeks ago when you laughed about how easy I was to fool. Neil, please, I'll be in touch. I ended the call. The apartment was quiet again. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city lights back at me, fractured and distant. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was colder than that. Not joy, just equilibrium restored. Cassidy was beginning to understand what it felt like to be the expendable one. Albert, pressured, was revealing exactly who he had always been. The protector she thought she had secured was simply a strategist protecting himself. And the final phase was already underway. 3 days earlier, I had sent Helena Richter a carefully worded email from an anonymous account. It contained no accusations, no emotion, just information. Thursday afternoon hotel reservations that coincided with Albert's board meetings. Copies of jewelry receipts that had never appeared in Helena's possession. Photographs Marcus had taken of Albert and Cassidy dining publicly enough to be reckless. Nothing illegal. Nothing traceable, just facts provided by a concerned observer. Helena responded within hours, not to me directly, but through action. Marcus confirmed she had retained her own investigative firm. Quiet, expensive, thorough. By now she would have confirmation that her husband's affair wasn't casual, that there was a pregnancy, that there were financial transfers, that another man, me, had nearly been maneuvered into subsidizing it. From everything Marcus uncovered about her past responses, Helena did not rage. She audited. She restructured. She eliminated vulnerabilities. Albert's prior affairs had cost him privately, but left him intact publicly. This time the scale was different. There was documentation, a child, financial entanglement that intersected with reputational risk. Helena valued legacy above comfort, and legacy does not tolerate liabilities. Albert believed caution had insulated him. That compartmentalization was controlled. That charm and wealth formed armor. He had not accounted for the possibility that one of the people he categorized as manageable would become methodical, Tomorrow morning, Helena's attorneys would serve him with divorce papers and a restraining order. Standard language, Marcus predicted, but aggressive positioning, asset freezes, immediate review of shared holdings, emergency board notifications where necessary to protect shareholder confidence. No explosions, no screaming scenes, just pressure applied to structural joints. Cassidy thought she was calling me for rescue. Albert thought he was managing fallout. Neither understood that the machinery was already turning, and it no longer required my anger to keep it moving. His company's bank accounts would be locked while officials examined suspicious financial activity flagged by an anonymous source to the proper authorities. The empire he had so meticulously assembled would start crumbling piece by piece, and he'd be far too consumed with protecting himself to keep controlling Cassidy or pushing her to maintain the lies. And Cassidy would quickly realize that carrying the child of an influential man was entirely different from carrying the child of a man whose influence had vanished in a single night. I poured a glass of wine, one I had personally selected from a little shop I'd found in my new neighborhood, and lifted it in honor of my grandmother. "Revenge is best enjoyed cold, Magretta," I murmured softly. "Just the way you always told me." Beyond the windows, the city shimmered, alive with opportunities I had only just begun to uncover. For the first time in 2 years, maybe even longer, I felt truly unchained, not merely released from Cassidy's deception or Albert's manipulation, but liberated from the exhausting role of fixing everyone else's chaos. My phone vibrated with a message from Marcus. "It's finished. Helena's team acted sooner than we thought. Albert's offices were shut down this morning, and he's been taken into custody for tax evasion and fraud. Figured you'd want the update." A slow smile spread across my face as the final pieces of my strategy locked perfectly into place. Albert would now face years entangled in federal indictments, a brutal divorce, and the total collapse of the empire he once ruled so confidently. He no longer had the luxury of issuing threats, no longer possessed the money or influence to sabotage careers or intimidate vulnerable, expectant women. And for the first time in years, Cassidy stood completely on her own. No shield, no strategist, no one left to clean up the consequences of her decisions. As my grandmother would have put it, it was a deeply satisfying feast. 6 months later, I found myself seated in a cafe near my new office, leisurely flipping through the morning newspaper and savoring the calm rhythm of a quiet Saturday, when a headline caught my eye and finally sealed that painful chapter of my life. Local businessman sentenced to 7 years for tax evasion and fraud. The report was concise yet comprehensive. Albert Richter, once the CEO of RTOR International Holdings, had received a 7-year federal prison sentence and was ordered to repay $4.8 million to multiple government agencies. His corporate empire had been dismantled to settle outstanding debts, his properties confiscated, his name dragged through the mud. The article also noted that his wife, Helena Richter, had finalized their divorce while he awaited trial and had publicly declared she had no intention of visiting him behind bars. Cassidy's name didn't appear anywhere in the piece, but my attorney had informed me that 3 months earlier, she had delivered a baby boy, a child Albert would only ever see across a prison visitation table, if Helena even allowed that much access. Cassidy was now staying with her sister in Phoenix, employed as a receptionist at a small medical clinic, barely getting by on $12 an hour. During our divorce proceedings, she had finally confessed the truth, acknowledging that the child wasn't mine and surrendering any request for alimony or support, not from guilt or sudden integrity, but because maintaining the deception would have required Albert's protection, and Albert was no longer capable of protecting anyone. Once she stopped resisting, my attorney had been more than satisfied with how swiftly the entire matter wrapped up. I folded the newspaper with deliberate care and placed it beside my cup, experiencing something that felt close to closure, not triumph. There was no real pleasure in watching 2 lives collapse, even if they had earned every consequence. But there was a quiet sense of finality, of scales balanced, and justice quietly delivered. The cafe hummed with the steady warmth of a Saturday morning rush, parents corralling energetic kids, couples lost in shared paperbacks, students hunched over laptops fueled by caffeine and ambition. Ordinary people immersed in uncomplicated lives, untouched by intricate lies or meticulously engineered betrayals. It was the kind of simple, honest scene I'd almost forgotten during my marriage to Cassidy, when every conversation had been layered with half-truths and hidden agendas. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" I glanced up to see a woman around my age standing beside my table, motioning toward the empty chair opposite me. She had gentle eyes framed by wire-rimmed glasses and streaks of gray woven through her brown hair, styled plainly in a way that made her seem both capable and easy to talk to. A weathered leather briefcase hung from her shoulder, and she carried what looked like a stack of student essays waiting for red ink. "Not at all," I said, nodding toward the chair. "Please." She settled in with an appreciative smile, arranging her papers across the table with the efficient ease of someone accustomed to turning any corner into a workspace. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell," she introduced herself, offering her hand. "And thank you. I've got nearly 30 essays to grade before Monday, and my apartment's being fumigated, so at the moment I'm technically without a home." "Neil Harrison," I replied, shaking her hand. "What do you teach?" "Biology at the community college." "And you?" "Electrical engineering. Though I'm between projects right now, so I've unexpectedly gained more free time than I'm used to." She smiled, an open, genuine expression that reached her eyes in a way I'd almost forgotten people could manage. "Free time," she said lightly. "I vaguely remember that from my grad school days." For the next hour, we shared an easy, unspoken rhythm. She marked essays, occasionally murmuring things like, "Did this student even glance at the instructions?" while I answered emails from prospective clients. There was a calmness to it I hadn't felt in years, sitting beside someone without the pressure to entertain, impress, or constantly scan their expressions for the slightest hint of irritation. When she reached the bottom of her stack, she glanced up and noticed me looking her way. "I'm sorry," she said with a soft chuckle. "I tend to talk to myself when I grade. Comes with the territory." "Don't apologize," I replied. "I was just thinking how refreshing it is to sit next to someone who's exactly what they seem to be." One eyebrow lifted in curiosity. "That's a very specific compliment." Before I could overthink it, I found myself giving her a brief version of the truth about Cassidy. Without the sharp edges, without the resentment, just the essentials. A marriage that unraveled when I realized my wife had been leading a second life. A divorce finalized 3 months ago. The slow, deliberate work of starting over from nothing. What caught me off guard was how effortless it felt to say it out loud. How the story seemed lighter when shared with someone untouched by its history. "I'm sorry," she said gently once I finished. "That must have been incredibly hard." "It was," I admitted. But in an unexpected way, it was freeing too. For 2 years, I thought I was losing my grip on reality, because nothing she said ever fully made sense. Nothing she did was quite aligned. Finding out I wasn't imagining it, that the lies were real, was almost a relief. Sarah considered that quietly, nodding with understanding. "I notice that with some of my students," she said thoughtfully. "They walk in convinced they're unintelligent because they can't make sense of their relationships, can't understand why their partner's behavior never quite adds up. Most of the time, the issue isn't their intelligence at all. They're simply involved with someone who lies as naturally as breathing." "Is that really that common?" I asked. "More than people realize," she replied. "Chronic liars are often skilled at convincing others that the confusion lies in their perception, not in the deception itself. It's a psychological tactic known as gaslighting." I let that settle. Replaying the countless moments Cassidy had dismissed my concerns as paranoia whenever I pointed out the cracks in her stories. "How does someone come back from that?" "Gradually," she said, offering a reassuring smile, "and usually with the support of people who are willing to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable. People whose only motive is simple decency." We ended up talking for another hour about psychology and circuitry, about the novels stacked on our nightstands and the countries we hope to see someday. She was divorced too, 3 years now, after uncovering that her ex-husband had been siphoning funds from the nonprofit where he worked. She understood betrayal in a way that didn't require explanation, understood how long it takes to trust your own instincts again, after someone you love has spent years quietly eroding them. When she finally gathered her graded papers into neat piles, I felt an unexpected reluctance at the thought of the afternoon ending. "Would you like to have dinner sometime?" I asked, mildly startled by my own directness. "Somewhere with straightforward food and equally straightforward conversation." She smiled, that same open, unguarded smile that had drawn me in from the start. I'd like that. On one condition. No slipping into foreign languages I can't follow. I laughed, the sound rising freely, untouched by caution. Deal. English only. And the full truth, even when it's painfully dull. Especially when it's dull, she replied. Plain, honest truth doesn't get nearly enough credit. We swapped numbers, and as I watched her disappear down the sidewalk, I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. Anticipation. Not the frantic hope that someone else's love would finally validate my existence, but an authentic curiosity about what could grow between two people who had each paid dearly to understand the importance of honesty. That night, I made my usual weekly call to my parents, a ritual I'd started after the divorce to rebuild connections rooted in sincerity rather than illusion. You sound different, my mother observed toward the end of our chat. Lighter, maybe even happy. I think I am, I admitted, glancing around my apartment, clean, uncluttered, furnished with pieces I liked, simply because they felt right, shelves lined with books I'd chosen out of genuine interest, not to impress anyone who might wander through. I'm starting to figure out who I am when I'm not molding myself into what someone else expects. That's an important lesson, she said gently, even if it took a little longer than it should have. After we said goodnight, I poured a glass of wine and stepped onto the balcony, gazing at the city lights stretching into the distance. Somewhere in that sprawl, Cassidy was likely rocking her son to sleep in a modest apartment, adjusting to the weight of single motherhood on an hourly wage. Somewhere else, Albert was navigating the rigid hierarchy of prison life, counting the slow passage of years. Their carefully constructed web of lies had eventually buckled under its own strain, leaving them far worse than if they'd chosen transparency from the start. I didn't pity them. Choices carry consequences, and they have acted fully aware of the stakes. But the desire for revenge had faded too. They no longer occupied space in my narrative, no longer held any power over my calm or my direction. They had become exactly what their actions warranted, irrelevant. My phone vibrated with a message from Sarah. Just wanted to say thank you for a wonderful afternoon. I'm really looking forward to dinner. And relax, she added in a second text. I won't be evaluating your German skills. I smiled at the screen and replied, looking forward to it as well. Just so you know, I'm fully fluent in German, but I swear I'll only use that ability for noble purposes from now on. Her answer came almost immediately. A man of mystery and humor. I have a feeling I'm going to enjoy discovering more about you, Neil Harrison. I placed my phone down and returned my gaze to the skyline. Thousands of glowing windows reflecting thousands of separate lives. Most of them, I imagined, far less complicated and far more truthful than the one I'd inhabited for the past 2 years. For the first time since that disastrous dinner at Doza's house, hope felt real. Not because I was waiting for someone to rescue me with love. Not because I needed another person to validate my worth, but because I had finally grown comfortable with the man I was when no one was observing. When no one expected me to perform or fix or bend. The next day, I would call Sarah and arrange dinner. I would keep expanding my new business, nurturing connections grounded in respect instead of manipulation. I would continue discovering who Neil Harrison truly was when he wasn't trying to save anyone, when he wasn't chasing approval from people who had never intended to offer it sincerely. There's a German word for what I was feeling. Befreiung. Liberation. Release from chains. Freedom from deceit. Freedom from the exhausting burden of being the answer to someone else's chaos. My grandmother would have understood. Through learning her language, I had absorbed her greatest lesson that sometimes betrayal hands you an unexpected gift. The chance to uncover who you are once you stop shaping yourself into what others demand. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear them. And for more powerful stories about resilience, justice, and new beginnings, make sure you subscribe to A Father's Wrath.